It cost my father a daughter, and it cost my brother a business. But it started long before any of that. It started the night I was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while my parents argued in the next room about money, and my brother Colton's name kept coming up, over and over, like it was the only word they knew. My name is Waverly. Waverly Osei Bonsu. My mother is Ghanaian Canadian. My father is from a small town outside of Thunder Bay, and I grew up in Mississauga in a house that had enough love for one child and somehow managed to stretch it thin enough to cover two, but only if you looked at it from a certain angle, in a certain light, and didn't look too closely at where the fabric was wearing through. Colton is 3 years older than me. He was always the one who could walk into a room and make everyone look up. Big laugh, easy smile, the kind of confidence that doesn't come from experience but from being told, over and over again, that the world belongs to you. My father started that. My mother continued it. And I spent 18 years watching it happen and telling myself it was fine, that families work differently, that one day I would understand why things were the way they were. I'm 29 now. I understand. When I was 14, I wanted to take a ceramics class at the Community Arts Center. It was $60 for 8 weeks. My father said we didn't have the money. 2 weeks later, Colton got a brand new hockey equipment set full kit, new skates, the bag with the team logo on the side. I counted. It was over $800. When I asked my mother about it, she said hockey was an investment. I said ceramics was an investment too, just a different kind. She said that wasn't the same thing and walked away. That was the first time I understood that we don't have the money had conditions attached to it. I studied hard anyway. I always did. Not because I was trying to prove something, I genuinely loved learning, loved the way a difficult problem would sit in your brain like a stone you couldn't stop turning over until suddenly, one morning, you'd wake up and know exactly how it fit. I was good at math, good at strategy, good at thinking 3 steps ahead while the people around me were still figuring out step 1. I got into the business program at the University of Waterloo on a partial scholarship. When I called home to tell my parents, my mother cried happy tears and my father said he was proud of me and then asked if the scholarship covered everything. It didn't. There was still a gap of about $14,000 a year. My parents said they'd contribute to the shortfall from what they called the education fund. I didn't know much about this fund. They'd mentioned it vaguely over the years, something they'd been building since we were children. I assumed it was split between me and Colton. I was in second year when I found out it wasn't split equally. It wasn't split at all. Colton had received the entire fund, $62,000 the year before, to help him buy into a franchise opportunity that ultimately failed within 8 months. By the time I needed the money, there was nothing left. My father told me over the phone. Not in person. Over the phone, in November, when the second semester tuition was due and I was sitting in my student apartment eating instant ramen because I'd already spent my part-time job earnings on groceries and bus passes. He said, "I'm sorry, Waverly, but Colton needed it. He's trying to build something." I said, "I'm building something too." He said, "It's different." I took out a student loan. I picked up a second part-time job. I tutored other students on weekends. I graduated in 4 years with honors and a debt load that took me another 5 years to clear. And during all of that, I went home for Christmas and birthdays and long weekends, and I smiled and passed the potatoes and asked Colton about his latest plans, and listened to my father talk about how Colton was going to figure it out, how Colton just needed the right opportunity, how Colton had so much potential if people would just give him a chance. I was 24 when I got my first serious job offer. A mid-sized operations consulting firm based in Toronto, working with small and medium businesses on growth strategy. It wasn't glamorous, but it was exactly what I wanted: real problems, real stakes, work that mattered. I was good at it almost immediately. Within 18 months, I was being fast-tracked. Within 3 years, I had enough savings to start thinking about something bigger. Colton, at 27, had tried 4 different business ventures. Each one had been partly funded by my parents, and each one had failed for what he described as external reasons: bad timing, bad partners, bad luck. He never talked about what he might have done differently. My father never asked. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me even when it isn't offered in return. Colton wasn't malicious. He wasn't cruel in the way that some people are cruel, deliberately and with awareness. He was something harder to argue with. He was careless. He moved through the world like someone who had never learned that things have weight, that choices echo, that what you take from one person doesn't just disappear into the air, but lands somewhere, on someone. He took from me the way you take a pen off someone's desk without thinking, because it was there and you needed it and it didn't occur to you to ask. The problem is that what he took wasn't a pen. I was 26 when Colton came to me with the idea for Lakeview Social, a co-working and events space in the West End of Toronto. He'd found a location, a converted warehouse space near Dundas West, and had already done some preliminary work on the concept. Flexible office memberships, event rentals, a small cafe. It was actually a good idea. Better than his previous ones. He had a real business plan, not just enthusiasm. And when he sat across from me at a coffee shop and walked me through the numbers, I could see the bones of something viable. He needed a co-founder, someone with capital and operational expertise. He looked at me and said, "You're the smartest person I know, Waverly. I want to do this with you." I should have said no. I knew, somewhere in the part of my brain that processes patterns, that this was not a safe investment of my trust. But another part of me, the part that was still 12 years old at the kitchen table, still hoping my name would come up too, heard my brother say I was the smartest person he knew and wanted very much for that to be the beginning of something different. I said yes. We formalized the partnership. A proper legal agreement, drafted by a lawyer. I paid for myself, because I had learned by then that hope and documentation are not mutually exclusive. I contributed $60,000 in capital and took a 49% ownership stake, slightly less than half, because Colton argued it was his concept and I agreed, which I now recognize as the first of several small concessions that should have been signals. The business launched in spring of the following year. I handled operations, vendor contracts, staffing, the financial systems. Colton handled sales, community building, the front-facing stuff. We were, genuinely, a good team. The first 8 months were slow but promising. By month 10, we were close to breaking even. By month 14, we were profitable. I was proud of it. I am still proud of it, even now, because I built something real and it worked. And the fact that what came after happened doesn't change what we built. I was 28 when Colton told me he was getting married. Her name is Renata Simansky Park. She's from Oakville, works in marketing, and she has the kind of energy that fills a room completely and doesn't leave space for anyone else's energy to exist alongside it. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it because it's accurate and because it's relevant to what happened. Colton had been dating Renata for about a year when he proposed. They got engaged on a Thursday, and by the following Monday, the wedding planning had begun with an intensity I had not previously associated with my brother, who had historically struggled to plan further ahead than next weekend. I was happy for him. I told him so, genuinely. I bought him a bottle of whiskey he'd mentioned, once wanting to try, and I texted Renata to congratulate her and offer to help however I could. The wedding was set for the following September, about 14 months away. Long engagement, big plans, 200 guests, a venue in Niagara-on-the-Lake. The kind of wedding that requires a spreadsheet and a project manager, which I suppose is why it didn't surprise me when my mother called in January to ask if I'd be willing to help coordinate some of the vendor logistics. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I spent the next 4 months helping to organize catering quotes, florist meetings, accommodation blocks at nearby inns for out-of-town guests. I built them a shared document with timelines and checklists, and a budget tracker. I did this on evenings and weekends, on top of running my share of the business. I mention this because I want it to be clear that my involvement was not passive. I was present. I contributed. I cared. In May, 6 months before the wedding, I got a phone call from my mother on a Sunday afternoon. I was walking along the waterfront, enjoying the first genuinely warm weekend of the year, when she called. She asked how I was, and I told her, and then she was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was working up to something. She said, "Waverly, I need to talk to you about the wedding." I said, "Okay." She said, "Renata has a specific vision for the day. Very intimate, very close family and close friends. She and Colton have been talking and they want the celebration to feel really personal." I said, "That sounds nice." Another pause. Then, "They've decided to keep the guest list tighter than originally planned. Just the very inner circle." I stopped walking. I was standing near a bench overlooking the water, and the sun was doing something beautiful on the surface of the lake, and I felt, suddenly, very still. I said, "Mom, what are you telling me?" She said, "Waverly, honey, you're not going to be on the guest list." I want to describe what that sentence felt like, but I'm not sure language has the exact shape for it. It wasn't quite like being stabbed, which is too dramatic. It was more like reaching for something you've always believed. Was there a railing, a wall, something solid, and finding empty air? The stumble before you catch yourself. That particular vertigo. I said, "I'm his sister." She said, "I know. But this is Renata's day too, and she..." I said, "Mom, I've been helping plan this wedding for 4 months." She said, "I know, and they're so grateful." I said, "I co-own a business with him." She said, "This is separate from that." I stood there by the water for a long time after I hung up, not crying, just standing, processing, doing what I have always done when I receive information that doesn't fit the shape of the world I thought I was living in, taking it apart, looking at it carefully, putting it back together into something I could understand. My brother had uninvited me from his wedding. My parents agreed with this decision. And I was, if I was reading the situation correctly, expected to accept this quietly and continue showing up at Christmas, and continuing to run our shared business, and continuing to be the version of Waverly that was useful, without ever being the version of Waverly that was included. I am someone who reads contracts carefully. I am someone who notices what is in an agreement and also what is not. I had read our partnership agreement many times over the 2 years since we'd signed it. Not because I was suspicious, but because I like to understand the documents I live inside of. And so I knew, with some precision, what my 49% ownership stake in Lakeview Social looked like and what it meant. I called my lawyer on Monday morning. I said, "I want to understand my options." She walked me through them. As a co-owner with a significant minority stake, I had rights that required negotiation to dissolve. Rights that couldn't simply be overridden. If I chose to exit the partnership, the process had clear steps. If I chose to remain but restructure my involvement, that was also possible. If I chose to do nothing, I could do nothing. All of it was on the table. I said, "If I initiated a buyout, him buying my stake, or us selling to a third party, what would my timeline look like?" She said it depended, but that a structured exit with proper valuation could be completed in 60 to 90 days. I thought about it for exactly 24 hours. Then I called Colton. He answered on the second ring, voice easy and warm, the way it always was when he wasn't thinking too hard about anything. "Hey, Wav. What's up?" I said, "I want to talk about the business." We met at a cafe near the Lakeview Social Space the following Wednesday. I brought coffee and a folder with the preliminary financial documents my lawyer had prepared. Colton sat across from me and looked at the folder, and his expression shifted slightly, like someone who has just noticed the weather changing. I told him I had heard from our mother about the wedding. I told him I was not going to make a scene about it or hold it over him. I told him I had thought carefully about what it meant and what I wanted, and what I had decided was this. I could not continue to be someone's business partner when that same person did not consider me family. Colton said, "Waverly, it was Renata's decision." I said, "You agreed to it." He didn't answer. I said, "I want to exit the partnership. I want a fair valuation based on our current revenue trajectory, and I want the process handled professionally and cleanly." He looked at the folder again. He said, "You're being serious." I said, "I am." He said, "This is about the wedding," I said. "The wedding is the reason I'm having this conversation. It's not the only reason." He leaned back in his chair. He looked, for just a moment, like the little boy who used to come into my room and lie on the floor while I did my homework and tell me about his day, back before the version of him that my father built had fully overwritten the version of him that actually existed. And I felt something, not anger, not satisfaction, something closer to sorrow, and I let myself feel it for exactly the time it deserved, which was not long. The valuation process took 6 weeks. My 49% stake, based on current revenue and projected growth, was assessed at approximately $340,000. Colton did not have that kind of liquidity. The solution, the only workable one, was to bring in a third-party buyer for my stake, which would mean Colton would have a new co-owner he didn't choose. I knew this going in. I also knew, through my professional network, that there was a woman named Deborah Tremblay Okonkwo, who ran a small investment group focused on exactly this type of community business space and had been looking for an entry point into the West End Toronto market. I had met her at a conference the previous year. She was sharp, organized, and understood operations. She would be, I believed, an excellent partner for Colton, in all the ways that I had been, and a few more besides. I made the introduction in August, 10 weeks before the September wedding. Deborah expressed interest almost immediately. Negotiations moved quickly. By the time the wedding weekend arrived, the paperwork was not yet finalized. Transfers of this kind take time, and there are regulatory filings and bank approvals involved, but the agreement in principle was signed. I was $340,000 away from what my brother had cost me over the years. My student loans, the ceramics class, the thousands of small moments when my name was the one that didn't come up. $340,000 doesn't cover all of that, but it covers the parts that have dollar signs on them, which is not nothing. The wedding was on a Saturday. I know this because my mother called me on the Friday before to ask. I'm still not entirely sure why, if I was doing okay. I said I was. She said she was sorry about how things had worked out. I said I believed her. I said I hoped they had a beautiful weekend. And I meant it, in the complicated way you can mean something and also mean something else at the same time. I spent that Saturday at the farmer's market near my apartment. I bought tomatoes and a new tea blend and a small piece of pottery from a local ceramic artist, because the universe sometimes has a sense of humor about things. I went home and made soup and read a novel and let the day be a day. On Sunday morning, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize at first. It took me a moment to realize it was Renata. She said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest." I waited. She said, "Colton told me this morning that his new business partner, Deborah, will be his primary decision-making partner going forward, and that the financial structure of the company has changed significantly. He said this was your doing. He said you arranged it before the wedding on purpose." I thought about what to write back for a long moment. Then I wrote, "I made a business decision that I had every right to make. The timing was a coincidence of process, not intention, but I won't pretend the decision itself wasn't connected to what happened." She wrote back after a pause. "Why didn't you say something? Why didn't you fight for your spot at the wedding?" I wrote, "Because my presence at your wedding was never mine to fight for. It was Colton's to offer. And he didn't." She didn't respond to that. Colton called me 2 weeks later. The edge in his voice was the particular kind that comes from embarrassment trying to present itself as anger. He said I had blindsided him. He said I had been petty. He said he hadn't expected me to do something like this. I said, "I gave you $60,000 and 3 years of my expertise. I helped plan your wedding for 4 months. And when you drew the line around your family, you drew it around everything except me." He was quiet. I said, "I didn't do this to hurt you, Colton. I did it because I finally understood that staying was costing me things I couldn't keep spending." He said, "So what now?" I said, "Now you have a business partner who will do excellent work with you and who has no complicated feelings about being your sister. That's probably better for the business." He didn't agree. But he didn't hang up, either. We talked for another 20 minutes, not resolving anything, not arriving anywhere new, but talking in the way that people sometimes talk when they are trying to remember they used to know each other well. In the months that followed, I had several conversations with my parents that were difficult and necessary and, I think, ultimately honest in a way that our family had not been for a very long time. My father admitted, in a late October phone call that I hadn't expected to go the way it went, that he had not treated my education the same way he treated Colton's. He didn't apologize directly. My father is not built for direct apologies, but he said, I made choices I should have made differently, and for him that was significant, and I chose to receive it as such. My mother came to visit me in November. We walked along the same waterfront where I had taken that phone call in May, and she was quiet for a long time, and then she said, I don't know when we stopped seeing you. I said, I don't know either, Mom. But I'm still here. That conversation is the reason we still talk every week. Lakeview Social is doing well, from what I've heard. Deborah is, as I predicted, an excellent operator, and Colton has apparently grown into the partnership in ways I hadn't been sure he was capable of. I hope it's true. I hope the version of my brother that can be a real partner to someone in business, in marriage, is the version that gets to stay. I used the money from my exit to do two things. The first was to pay off the last of my student debt in a single transfer on a Tuesday morning in December from a coffee shop near my office in about 4 minutes. I sat there afterward and tried to feel something dramatic about it, and mostly I just felt clean, like a window after rain. The second was to seed a small consulting practice of my own, no partners, no outside investment, just my expertise and my clients, and the work I know how to do. I turned 29 in January. My mother called at exactly midnight because she had always done that, no matter what, even during the hard years, and I picked up and she sang to me in Twi, which she had done every single birthday of my life, and I sat on my couch with a cup of tea, and I let myself be exactly where I was. There's a woman in my building named Priya, who has been my closest friend for 3 years. There's a colleague named Tomas, who I have lunch with every Wednesday, and who makes me laugh harder than almost anyone. There's my maternal grandmother in Brampton who calls me her sharp one and presses my hand when I visit and tells me stories about her own life that I am only now old enough to fully understand. These people are my family in the way that matters most, not by accident of birth, but by the daily, chosen act of showing up for each other. I was not invited to my brother's wedding. That is still true. I think it always will be. Some facts don't get softer with time. They just become something you can carry without bending. But I was also the one who understood the value of what I had built and refused to keep giving it away. I was the one who read the contract, knew my rights, and acted accordingly. I was the one who, when the ground shifted under me, found out I had better footing than I thought. There is a kind of clarity that only comes after you stop waiting for the people who should have seen you to finally look. It doesn't arrive as a revelation. It arrives quietly, in ordinary moments at a farmer's market on a September Saturday, making soup alone in a clean kitchen, midnight on a birthday with your mother's voice in your ear, and you realize that the life you've built is the one you actually wanted, and that you built it yourself, and that no one can uninvite you from that. If there is something I would want someone to take from all of this, it would be this. The people who benefit most from your patience will often be the last to recognize it. Advocating for yourself is not disloyalty. It is the most honest thing you can offer a relationship. And when someone draws the circle of their family and leaves you outside it, they are not making a statement about your worth. They are making a statement about their own limitations. Those are not the same thing, even when they feel like it. Not every family you are born into will choose you back. But you always have the right to choose yourself first. And some of us, the quiet ones, the ones who kept their name on the paperwork, who read every clause, who stayed 3 steps ahead, have known that for longer than anyone gave us credit for.